Hello again everybody, and the third part of my talk's about Hadrian's Wall, and this part is about the life of Hadrian's Wall after Hadrian. So it was less than 20 years after Hadrian had died that Hadrian's Wall ceased to be the frontier of the Roman Empire in northern Britain, if ever it had been really the frontier in the conventional sense. The Emperor Antoninus Pius decided to move things forward to occupy lowlands, what nowadays we call lowland Scotland and Northumberland, and the new frontier line will be between the Forth and the Clyde, more or less between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and a new great big border wall was built. And this wasn't made of stone, which is why there's much less evidence of it now. This was made of turf and timber, and it was known as the Antonine Wall. Now, after Antoninus Pius, under a succession of emperors, not least Marcus Aurelius, the emperor at the beginning of who gets snuffed out at the beginning of Gladiator, the next 40 or 50 years was a period of very great disturbance and disorder in that part of Britain between the Antonine Wall and Hadrian's Wall. It's very difficult for us to know what actually went on, since there's no coherent literary record of that, and the archaeology is difficult to understand and pretty patchy. So the next time that we really hear of Hadrian's Wall is at the end of the reign of Septimius Severus, the emperor who died in York in 211 AD. Now, he was a great campaigning emperor. He obviously decided he was going to campaign in northern Britain. He was going to sort things out and establish a proper frontier. It was at the end of his reign that a substantial amount of building work, rebuilding work, started on Hadrian's Wall. So much so, in fact, that Hadrian's Wall was actually known as Septimius Severus's Wall for well over 1,000 years. Anyway, after he died in York in 211, his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, who were supposed to rule jointly after him, they both left Britain fairly sharpish, went back to the continent. Caracalla then seemed not very much interested in Britain, but quite interested in killing other people, including his own brother Geta. So he was the sole emperor, not a joint emperor. What happened on Hadrian's Wall for the next 100 years or so was a process of consolidation and pacification and integration. One very interesting little detail comes from this period, and that is, it's a result of restrictions on the Roman army members being allowed to marry. It was at the end of the early 3rd century that Septimius Severus allowed Roman soldiers legally to marry, because up until that point any marriages had been unofficial. We have a tombstone, or rather we have two tombstones, one of which comes from South Shields and the other comes from Corbridge, and this is from a married couple. He was in the army. She was a former slave called Regina from Essex. He, interestingly, was called Barates, and he came from Palmyra, right in the far east of the empire in what is, Palmyra now. Been much in the news in recent times, with quite a lot of it blown up by so-called Islamic State. But Barates and Regina were married, and their tombstones mention each other, and they show about quite a lot about life in northern Britain in and around Hadrian's Wall. So South Shields and Corbridge, just south of the wall, with Barates and Regina. Quite interesting. So what happened after that? Well, there's quite a bit more rebuilding around 300 or so. There seems to have been a sustained attack by the Picti, who were lowland Scots, the painted ones, and quite a lot of rebuilding and refortification happened on Hadrian's Wall around that time. And then follows a period of gradual integration and pacification, as much as it had been in the 3rd century. By 409, 410, effectively Roman rule in Britain was at an end, because the Emperor Honorius said he was no longer able to send reinforcements to defend Britain against the invasions of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes from northern Europe. Britain was on its own. What happened to Hadrian's Wall then? Well, it gradually started to be dismantled by people who wanted to build farmhouses and churches. One interesting little detail is If you go to Hexham Abbey, and you know where to look in the crypt, there are signs to it, if you go there, part of an inscription from Hadrian's Wall put up by Caracalla and Geta has been used in the foundations of Hexham Abbey. But the interesting little detail is that the name of Geta has been chiselled out, more or less, because after Caracalla had murdered Geta, Geta suffered what was called damnatio memoriae. You were going to be airbrushed out of history. So an interesting little detail there about the second life of Hadrian's Wall. We don't hear much about Hadrian's Wall until about 1600, when the headmaster of Westminster School, one Mr. W. Camden, probably Reverend W. Camden, wrote about it in his book Britannia. And about 100 years later, Reverend John Horsley also wrote about it in a big survey of the Romans in Britain. But the really significant thing happened around the later part of the 19th century, when the Newcastle town clerk, one John Clayton, decided he was going to sort Hadrian's Wall out because it had all fallen into ruin. So he set about rebuilding it and restoring it. Now, in some ways this was a great thing, because quite a lot of it you can still see, and the bit you can still see in the central part of the wall is largely John Clayton's restoration. But in other ways it was a really bad thing, because he did it in a very un-Roman way. He built it more or less as a dry stone wall without mortar, and so that has had a number of consequences. So for modern archaeologists, I don't know whether to laugh or cry at the work of John Clayton. Anyway, it is what it is. The modern version of Hadrian's Wall is looked after now by various groups, including English Heritage, and it's a World Heritage Site. So, well worth going to visit, and you can walk along the length of it. I'd recommend going west to east, and then at the end of the afternoon you've got the sun behind you, not in your eyes, but it's a great thing to do. So, future talk is going to be about life on the wall, and particularly about some letters, very unusual letters, which have survived to the present day.